I know we're bringing in some more chairs if people are having difficulty. Well, good morning to all of you. I know for some of you who traveled today, your morning started quite some time ago. My name is Deborah Freeman. I'd like to welcome all of you to this EIR seminar. As you know, we find ourselves in a very tumultuous time, a time where I think if we follow events closely, as I know all of you do, there's very little that would argue against the fact that we're in the midst of a tremendous financial unraveling and a period of great political volatility. Of course, here in the United States, we're very close to our presidential elections. During the course of the last several months, Lyndon LaRouche, who is a candidate for the Democratic nomination for president, has, in a series of public addresses and national TV broadcasts, had a great deal to say about the current situation in the world and about the role that the United States should in fact play in it. Now, just a few weeks before the Democratic convention, Mr. LaRouche has thrown the full weight of his presidential campaign into a drive to defeat, actually to impeach, the current governor of Pennsylvania, Tom Ridge, who Mr. LaRouche and others has charged is in fact guilty of pursuing a policy which is epitomized by the policies of the conservative revolution associated with Newt Gingrich, that would in fact be the equivalent, that are in fact the equivalent of crimes for which people were tried and hung at Nuremberg. We have recently purchased about 23 half-hour television spots that will broadcast in the state of Pennsylvania. We believe that this is the critical issue leading into the Democratic convention, critical, in fact, to shaping the policy of our nation, both domestically and internationally. And I think that today you will learn much more about that, as well as other key issues. Just to tell you what the format is today, Mr. LaRouche will be our keynote speaker. We will have an opportunity for question and answers when he's done. There will then be a lunch break. We will reconvene after lunch for a major international presentation. There will also be Q&A after that, and I understand that Mr. LaRouche will also be available at that time. So now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you the founder of Executive Intelligence Review and Democratic presidential candidate Lyndon LaRouche.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you all. Now, this afternoon, you'll discover that Helga recently spent some time in China prior to some other foreign travel. And before that, before she was in China, we were both in Russia. And she will give you some insights into the policy perspective globally we have for dealing with the present international financial and strategic crisis. Today, this morning, I'll address the same crisis from a different standpoint of how we're fighting the battle, the global strategic battle, on the battlefields not of Gettysburg, but of Pennsylvania in general. Now, back in 1793, France, under a terrible government, was overrun by invading armies which were victorious on every front. The word in Paris was that the defeat and consequent dismemberment of France was a military inevitability. At that point, they found a sucker to take over the defense forces of France. His name was Lazare Carnot. He was a rather famous military genius who had once spent time in the Bastille because of court politics. who had been a student of Gaspard Monge, who was the leading scientific thinker of France and at that point of Europe. Lazare Carnot, under conditions of imminent defeat, reorganized the policies, the military policies of France and its armies, often fired major generals to replace them with sergeants quite successfully. If he found the major generals keeping the troops in the barracks too long, or if they didn't cross the river that night rather than waiting for the next morning, things like that, terrible crimes. But a very specific thing which he did, apart from revolutionizing modern warfare by uses of development of mass mobile field artillery fire and things of that sort, was to change the policies of France, that rather than attacking the adversary on a broad front in a kind of federated approach of mass attacks on every front simultaneously, which only a jarhead would do, was to focus the military power of France at each point at certain specific points. And by picking a point on which to attack, to turn the flank of the enemy and rout him. Now that's exactly what we're doing with the campaign in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We have limited forces. We must change the policy of the United States. We must ensure that the Democrats take over the House of Representatives and hopefully also the Senate. We must panic the country into a perception that everything that contract with America represents is gone, so that people who are elected to Congress on the Democratic line will behave above their level of personal morality as moral figures in the Congress. The way you get troops to function is you move them. Get them out of the barracks and move them. The way you get politicians to function morally is to panic them into doing so. You create a rush which they have no alternative but to do it. All the guys behind them will trample them. That's how you do it. And that's our objective. It is also our objective to change the foreign policy. And we are addressing not a particular issue. These days, people like to talk about issues, including abortions and other kinds of issues. We're not attacking an issue. We're attacking an axiom. Let me explain it to you. People say that we have opinions, but people don't have opinions. Opinions have them. They are gripped by opinions. They say, it's my opinion. No, you are owned by that opinion, not the opinion by you. And how do we form opinions? Well, I ask you to think of a simple Euclidean geometry, which some of you were exposed to somewhere in the educational process, which consists of a group of theorems and postulates, construction postulates. The characteristic of this collection of theorems, which we call a theorem lattice, is that all of the theorems are supposed to be deductively consistent, or deductively not inconsistent. And then we apply the methods of Socrates and Plato. We discover that the common features of the consistency of these theorems resides in the fact that they share a set of common underlying assumptions, such as the assumptions of 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time in the Euclidean conception of space-time, the conception of the particle, of greater and lesser, all these things which are assumptions. They're not necessarily true. They're assumptions. And every theorem which is consistent will share a certain lack of inconsistency with these underlying assumptions. Now, people generally are not aware fully of the assumptions which control their opinion forming. And therefore, that of which you're not aware, but which controls you, grips you. And you behave in ways that you yourself can't understand because there are things going on in your mind of which you're not aware, which are forcing you to behave in a certain way. axioms, postulates, definitions, which can be smoked out, but which in large part you may be totally unaware. Therefore, what happens is when you face an event, you react to the event with a proposition. Anything that occurs, looking at a sign on a street, or crossing a street, or meeting a person you've not met before, hearing something said you've not said, watching an accident, whatever. These things evoke from you a sense of how shall I respond to this? You attempt to articulate in one sense or another a response. That may be called a proposition. It may not be a proposition you're wedded to, but it's one you're offering tentatively. You say, I've got to think about, I think it's this. I think this means I should do that. A proposition. You then examine the proposition, if you're a responsible person, and say, do I really believe that? What you're doing is you're doing the same thing you do in a geometry class when you're given a proposition. You are going to try to test the proposition to see if it passes the test of being a theorem. Are there inconsistencies which you can point out in what you're proposing which should force you to correct that proposition? And by this process of correcting your propositions, you end up with a theorem. You may not think much about it. It may just go on in your mind without much thought about it. But you end up with an opinion, which you might call a considered opinion, which decides whether or not you're going to act and how you're going to act. And so you go out and behave accordingly. But then step back and examine this. This means that you don't respond to events. You don't respond to reality. Your reaction to reality, your interpretation of it, your assessment of it, is controlled. It's controlled by hidden beliefs, or beliefs which are in large degree hidden, assumptions, which have the character of axioms, postulates, and definitions. And every response you make is influenced, controlled, as a puppet by puppet strings, by the axioms, postulates, and definitions which you've accepted. Now, the progress of mankind shows that man has the ability to free himself from any fixed set of such assumptions, axioms, postulates, and definitions. That man is not condemned to behave in a traditional way. Man is not like a jackass, some are but not supposed to be, who has to behave the way his father behaved before him, and his grandfather before him, and his great-grandfather before him. That is the way a jackass behaves. That is not the way a human being behaves. For if human beings behave that way, then human beings would be what Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, professes to be. A pretentious fellow who considers himself a higher ape, who insists that people are the higher apes, trying to make monkeys of us all. Right? But we are not higher apes. For if we were any existing or imaginable type of higher ape, then under the conditions which existed on this planet during the recent 2 million years of the ice age in the northern hemisphere, this planet would never have seen more than several million living human individuals. Because we would have all behaved as our monkey-like or baboon-like or Prince Philip-like, the same thing, ancestors had behaved, our fathers, our grandfathers, great-grandfathers before us. The reason we are human is because we don't behave that way. Because we can make revolutions in our thinking. We can discover those assumptions of belief which grip us, those axioms, those postulates, those definitions. We can say, they're wrong. I am going to pull this thing out from me, free myself of this puppet string, and I'm going to think in a new way. That is what we call scientific and technological progress. And it's through scientific and technological progress that man has progressed so that at the end of the Middle Ages, we had reached on this planet several 100 million people, not 3 million apes like Prince Philip, who's a relic of a long gone past. We have today over 5.2 billion. Not only have we increased the population of the human species, but we've increased the demographic characteristics of humanity. People live longer. The death rate in every cohort of the population is less. The productivity and standard of living available to human beings is greater. The rate of progress can be greater as it was until about 30 years ago on this planet. All of this is done through revolutions, which we call scientific revolutions, technological revolutions, and cultural revolutions, discoveries in art and so forth. All of these discoveries involve violating what your grandfather, your great-grandfather, and his father before him did. By using that power which is unique to man, the cognitive powers of the mind, which we use in two ways. We relive great discoveries which were made by people before us. What we have is, for example, even language. For example, solar astronomy, which included then the knowledge of the approximately precise length of an equinoctial cycle, which is close to 25,000 years, was a quality of solar astronomy which achieved in Central Asia thousands of years before Mesopotamia was discovered by the Central European Indo-Europeans. The language, the Indo-European language, which we know fairly well because of work done by philologists during the last century in particular, was developed tens of thousands of years ago. It is a very powerful language as a group of languages. We learn that language. Not necessarily the form was spoken tens of thousands of years ago, but we learn a derivative of it. In Chinese, they're relics of a similar development, and so forth. When we learn the language as children and as growing adolescents, we are assimilating a series of scientific-like cultural discoveries from tens of thousands of years before. When we learn astronomy, when we look at the sky and we think we know something about it, it's because of these discoveries, which we reenact in our own mind as children or as adults. So we inherit from our forebears a series of revolutions in knowledge, of overturning axioms, postulates, and definitions, and freeing ourselves from the grip of ignorance, from the slavery of literacy. And in the process, we learn that our tradition is not to repeat what our fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers before us did. But our function as human beings is to repeat one thing: that process of discovery which sets man above Prince Philip. The cognitive process of discovery which is innate to every child, which is referred to in Genesis 1:26-30, that man is made in the image of God by virtue of this power of creativity, not to be a beast, a power to exert dominion in the universe increasingly. And there's no question of that. So therefore, when we face a problem, or we find aberration in the behavior of our fellow human beings, like they're voting Republican or something, then we have to question and find out what the assumptions are that cause people who look like human beings to behave like Prince Philip. We have to put our finger on the assumption, the axiomatic assumption, which causes people to stubbornly persist in doing the wrong thing. or we as a people to persist in doing the wrong thing, or why the United States does things that are contrary to its own vital interest. We have to find that axiom, like Socrates probing in a Platonic dialogue. Find the assumption which underlies opinion. Smoke it out. Test it. Is it true? If it's not, change it. So our job is not to change opinions. Our job is to change the axiomatic assumptions which control opinion. And that's what I want to address myself to today in terms of this campaign against Tom Ridge, and how the impalement of Governor Tom Ridge, whom some fool called Dole is even thinking of putting up as a vice presidential selection. I can't think of a better way for Dole to commit political suicide if he knew what I'm about to do to this guy Ridge. We can sweep the whole Congress with this. We can rise to the ridge of success. We can change U.S. foreign policy with this, as I shall explain. We can change the future of this country and the world for the better by defeating Ridge. How? The way Lazare Carnot understood strategy. So this is a session on strategy with respect to my great ancestor, in a sense, Lazare Carnot. How to change the country when it seems impossible to do so. How to change the world when it seems impossible to do so. By getting Tom Ridge. Now, one of the problems in politics and in life, which you probably have all observed sometime or other, is that people say, I'm going to do something. And they go out and they begin to fight the Battle of Gettysburg. They say, hey, this is a great idea. Let's try this in Massachusetts. So they pack up and go to Massachusetts and leave Gettysburg. The problem people have is a lack of ability to follow through to get the result. But rather they make what's called the old college try and then fail and walk away from it and go ahead and repeat the exercise in futility and frustration in the next precinct. It's like the Americans going to the polls. They never seem to be able to vote for the right candidate. They keep voting for this. They vote for a guy, and the next time they go back to vote him out. They vote another guy in, who next time they go back to vote him out. The American people will never seem to be able to get a satisfactory candidate elected. And these days, they don't seem to do much better in maid selection either. I just heard that Janet Reno's niece is marrying a racketeer. Not a very smart move. All right, so this is what the Ridge is about. Now let's start with Tom Ridge and what his crime is, which I don't need to elaborate fully because you have the pamphlet available here which details the argument. But to identify the crime, to look at the assumption involved in the crime, and then to examine us, the United States, in light of some other things that have gone on in the world in the past and in the present, to try to understand how it is that we in the United States came to tolerate, to elect, not to instantly impeach a fellow like Tom Ridge as a governor of a great state. How is it that we tolerated contract on Americans, Gingrich, which is the real name for what Gingrich has? How is it we tolerated policies which, in point of fact, are replicas of the policies for which we hung Nazi officials and professionals at Nuremberg under the title of crimes against humanity? I want to explain. This is not a case of first impression. This is not the first testing of a principle or a law. This principle was tested at Nuremberg by a gentleman from New York who was well known to Pennsylvania, Justice Robert Jackson and others. This is what we have hung people for at Nuremberg. And what we're accusing Ridge of is a crime which differs in no sense from what we hung people for, indicted, sentenced, and executed at Nuremberg. It's an exact copy. It is not analogy. It's not the kind of thing the crooked Justice Department Criminal Division does these days. It's a real, honest, good, God-fearing crime. Just plain crim, just like murder, robbery, so forth. Plain crime, natural law crime. Not some esoteric, bureaucratic, clerical invention. This man, under the pretext of balancing the budget, with other resorts at hand, set out to kill people, knowing, number one, that this would kill people in mass murder. How do you like 3,500 people? Was that good enough for mass murder? Would you execute a man who went out with a machine gun and killed 3,500 people? I wouldn't. I'd condemn him, convict him, put him away. There's a man who's prepared consciously to murder 3,500 people of his state, just like a Nazi criminal, in direct copy of what the Nazis did during the 1930s and getting on the road to Auschwitz. He did it. Not only did he know it, that he was doing it, but he knew it was a crime. Because we caught him at it once, we played a part in defeating the bill he was pushing. There were published figures showing that what he was proposing to do would, within about 6 months of its implementation, cause the death of about 3,500 people in the category of about 220,000 people who were affected by this selection. So he's targeted a group of people, a group of about 220,000 relatively helpless people in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, for withdrawing of their medical cards, which would cause, according to the best estimate, within the first 6 months of withdrawal, with this population, would cause 3,500 deaths. That is mass murder. And that is what we called at Nuremberg a crime against humanity, a capital crime against humanity. Therefore, in response to this, we did two things. I said we're going to focus everything in my campaign on impeaching this monster. We're not going to let Janet Reno go down there and wrestle with that alligator. We're going to impeach him. And by going for his impeachment, we are going to change the result of the national congressional election in November. Because we're going to make people accept the fact that this guy who's on the selection list for vice president for Bob Dole's campaign is a Nazi-type criminal, a mass-murdering criminal. And we have people in Pennsylvania who are prepared to stand up and say, I am personally being murdered by this governor. There will probably be legislative hearings at which people will testify, I am being murdered by this governor. Medical experts are prepared to testify that this is a fact, that the governor is murdering this person, that he's murdering a great number of other individual persons in the same way. We're putting the governor in the dock. We're getting the victims on parade. This man is murdering me. The expert witnesses, yes, he is murdering them. Step number two. The governor says, oh, I have to do this. I have to balance the budget. He can't balance his mind. How's he going to balance the budget? He said, all right, we'll show them how to deal with this. We'll show them where some tax revenue lies, which will balance the budget. Tax revenue which everybody knew existed. But he, as a good Republican, was going to tax those people. Those were his supporters. He's going to tax the lives of people who can't afford it, but he's not willing to tax his wealthy supporters, who happen to be parasites as well as supporters. He's got the face only a parasite could love. We proposed a tax which is otherwise called sometimes the Tobin tax, a turnover tax on purely speculative nature of financial securities, which, because of the vast amount of security speculative turnover in the world today, which is probably 99% of financial turnover in the world today, involves speculation, not production, nothing necessary. So let's tax some of that parasitical stuff that's sucking the blood out of this world economy. The thing that is clobbering Wall Street and other places these days, the banking system. Oh, easy. We're a very nominal tax, a fraction of a percent. You'd hardly notice it. A mosquito bite on an August evening. One mosquito bite, that's not so much. We can produce more than enough revenue to cover the deficit in the budget. Now the people can get their medical cards back and live. We don't have to kill anybody. Similarly, you don't have to cut the education. You don't have to destroy this. You don't have to do all the other things that are destroying mankind. So therefore, this fellow committed a crime. He says, but Mummy, I had to do it. He made me do it. Typical psychotic mass murderer. They made me do it. There was that look in her eye. I had to kill her. But now we've shown that he didn't have to do it. He had a choice of policy. That's Hitler's case. Hitler had a choice. He had an alternative policy. He didn't have to do it. There was no imperative. Whatever excuses the Nazis gave, they didn't have to do it. They chose to do it. They chose a policy which impelled them to do it. And it is the choice of a criminal policy, a policy which forces you, if you accept it, to kill people. That's the crime. The choice of balancing the budget is the crime. You say we have to balance the budget without changing our financial and economic policy. We just have to balance the budget. First, no, don't talk about anything else. We just, single issue, we're going to balance the budget. Okay? It's like a man out in the street looking for a prostitute. He's got one thing in mind. The consequences at the moment don't bother him. Balance the budget. That's the crime. Because to balance the budget means to commit the crime. You have to find another way to approach the problem. You have to recognize that the problem is that the United States, over the past 30 years, has gone from a nation which was committed to scientific and technological progress as a means for improving the conditions of life and solving the problems of people, to a nation which said, no, we don't want any more progress. We want to go away from an industrial society. We want to go to this kind of post-industrial paradise. As a result of that policy on a global scale, we have destroyed most of the planet. We have mass murdered tens of millions of people in Africa, South America, and so forth by this policy. We call it IMF conditionalities. We call it by other names. It amounts to the same thing. It means using goals of economic policy to impose conditionalities on governments and people which result in an increase in the death rate. An increase in the death rate on a mass scale among targeted groups of people within the population, whether it's a nation, whether it's a stratum of people in the population, or some other target group. It's the same thing. It is a crime against humanity. Now, what the American people have to do before they're willing to address this, we've told it to them many times, they've heard it many times, they've been told it, they just washes off like water on a duck's back. It's a crime against humanity, the largest scale ever in human history, going on all over the world in the name of economic policy. People are dying. People are submitted to grievous suffering. This whole nation is suffering with poverty, while idiots are babbling about prosperity. There's no prosperity. There's no recovery. This tremor on Wall Street, which is rumored to pull down about 1,000 points out of the Dow before it quits, is only a symptom of what's going on. This whole shebang is going. There's nothing to be done to save this system in its present form. Cannot be done. Nobody can do it. I can't do it. I wouldn't even try. Because it's evil. This system is killing people. We have to face up to that fact that when we make choices, we cannot go around and say, well, I like the sound of that policy. I like the argument. To say, but that policy will kill people. That would lead to a crime against humanity for which we hung people at Nuremberg. But I still like the policy. I want that policy. I want that car. I want that mistress. Whatever. That's what the problem is. So how do we get people to face the fact that there is such a thing as a crime against humanity? Years ago, back in the 1940s, at the end of the war, we didn't have any problem in understanding that. We understood what the crime was. We saw the concentration camps open. Everything had to be looked at. And the evidence of the crime was there, and it stunk. Today, it's happening all the time. We're encouraging. It's called policy. It's called contract on America, or contract on Americans. And we tolerate it. We watch the IMF reducing the life expectancy in Central Africa down from about 50-odd years to 40 years among adults. We see similar things throughout Central and South America. We see the same thing in Eastern Europe. We sit back and we say, well, that's IMF conditionalities. I guess we've got to go along with that. It's murder. And you have Russia, a nation which has not been conquered since the middle of the 15th century, with the end of the Tatар domination. A nation which still has nuclear weapons and which has a great deal of pride, which has a Soviet apparatus which is not a Russian apparatus. It's much more serious than the Russian apparatus. The Soviet apparatus was the real hard professionals with the connections. The Russian apparatus is a patsy, a soft patsy by comparison. This enraged Russian apparatus is watching Russia being killed. Russia is down today about, like Ukraine, to about 30% of its pre-1990 levels of economy. The same thing is true generally throughout Eastern Europe, the former Comecon. 30%. What the United States has done in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, less so, in the Balkans and so forth, is mass murder in going along with our French and British partners in what we're doing. Mass murder. Crimes against humanity. We're perpetrating it against Russians, who are becoming angrier and angrier and less rational and less rational. We have the same apparatus that pulled that stunt off in Russia, ran the recent election hoax in Israel, which is about to blow up, or on the verge of blowing up in the near future unless something changes the way it's going now. This country is disintegrating. Don't you know it? Morally, intellectually, the unity, the solidarity of the people of this country is disintegrating, is dissolving. France is disgusting. Italy is almost destroyed. Spain is destroyed. There's no government of Spain really anymore. It's a relic of the past. Italy hasn't had a government in about 5, 6 years. It's chaos looking for perdition. Africa, there are only 3 countries left in Africa which have any real integrity in black Africa. Sudan, Nigeria, and the Republic of South Africa. One bullet to the head of Mandela and the whole place goes up in smoke. Nigeria, if Nigeria is put under sanctions, that part of the world goes up in smoke. The largest, most populous nation in Africa will be murdered by the policies of the British and the black congressional caucus here. Sudan is on the gun. You get a prostitute by the name of Baroness Cox, takes Cain and Disabled, 2 reporters, and tracks them over to Kenya. And Baroness Cox takes her into the area of John Garang, who was a British agent run out of the British puppet in Uganda, Museveni. He's just a prostitute for hire, that's all he is. He's not nothing. Most of the people of southern Sudan have come to peaceful terms with their government, and they're better off as a result. And these 2 lying scoundrels are led hand in hand by this prostitute, Baroness Cox, across the border from Kenya into Garang's territory in southern Sudan. And they go up, and with a prearranged deal, they take a couple of kids, pretend to buy them, go through the dog and pony show of buying them and taking them back and returning them. which happens to be, there are things like that go on, which are relics of the tribal customs of taking captives and reprisals on a personal feud-like, Kentucky Mountain-like arrangement. They go on still in that part of the world as a result of long years of British anthropology and missionaries who foster this kind of stuff. There's no slavery in Sudan. There's problems in Sudan, as there is in every African country. The problems of poverty, the problems of backwardness, the problems of long colonial oppression. You'll find the vestiges there. You'll find them more abundant in the United States. Slavery, we call it private prisons. That's a form of slavery. Slave labor practiced in the United States today. Privatized prisons. In Germany, they call them Konzentrationslager under Hitler. Same thing, same principle. Different flavor, different disguise, but the same thing in the long run. That's the problem. We Americans have to face the fact that we can kill people, mass murder, crimes against humanity, through policy. And we have to accept the fact that Joe Dokes has an opinion. It's not something he has a right to if that opinion, expressed as policy, results in crimes against humanity. You don't have a right to an opinion. You have a moral right to develop a correct opinion. You have the right to discover a good opinion. You have a right to the sovereignty of a process. You have the right to be educated so you're capable and competent to have an opinion. You have the right to have some real newspapers, some real news media we don't have here anymore in the United States. Practically all the major media is controlled by London. Right? New York Slimes, right? The Boston Globe, a division of that. Then you have the Hollinger Press Syndicate, British intelligence. You have the Murdoch Press Syndicate. You have what the Washington Post is. You have the Chicago Tribune. You have the Los Angeles this. You have Associated Press or Associated Prostitutes. You have NBC, CBS. You have Jane Fonda's network, the CNN. As a matter of fact, Turner was punished. He was condemned for sins to marry Jane Fonda. Right? You have these things. It's all lies. Most of the media are lies. Hollywood is worse than the news media. Lies. Yes, you have a right to knowledge. You also have a responsibility to get it. But what we have to do is convince the American people that there is such a thing as a crime. Now, what you run up against is you say, this governor, Tom Ridge, is guilty of, by Nuremberg standards, of crimes against humanity, which we called a Nazi-style crime. Therefore, he is guilty of committing Nazi-style crimes. People say, well, that's what the Gingrich types are doing. We say, yes, but this guy is guilty. Let's not talk about generalities. Let's not dissolve the issue into generalities. Let's convict him, at least in your mind. And once you understand that he is a criminal, if you find that the contract with America as a whole is made up of people who are of the same disposition, then you say they are a criminal community. If you find that the policies which are tolerated, which correspond to this crime, are that, if they lead to this result, then those are criminal policies, which must be abjured. But you've got to get the first case. You've got to go to the first point where you walk through the case step by step and recognize, when you look at the face of Tom Ridge, you say, there is the modern American equivalent of a Nazi war criminal. When you see that and understand that, then you are prepared intellectually to recognize what Contract on Americans represents. And you don't get to this liberal mush-mush about, well, that's their opinion, some different people have different opinions. I say they're killing people. It's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of crime. So that's what we're doing. We take a point in the country where the exemplary crime of our times, the exemplary crime on a national scale as exemplified by Contract on Americans, the exemplary crime on an international scale, where the same policy, the same axiom, the same assumption, in the name of IMF conditionalities or something like that, or the World Trade Organization, or some other crazy idea, where that is killing people on an international scale. So we go from the microcosm of Pennsylvania to the nation and to the world. And we show that there's an assumption running loose on this planet, which is killing people, destroying nations. A criminality which is embodied in an exemplary fashion in Tom Ridge. We say, well, let's take care of all these guys. I say, okay, fine. The test is, will you take care of Tom Ridge first? Because if you won't go to the wall on the Tom Ridge case, with this guy individually, a governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, a Republican of the Gingrich stripe, a horse or a jackass out of the Mellon stable, who really wasn't that way. He was just bought to be that. And they fed him, and they put him in a stall for about 10 years, and then they brought him forth and made him a governor after grooming him. He's an eerie fellow, as they say. Huh? All right, if you can't go to the wall and say, this man is a Nazi, if you can't say that Tom Ridge is a Nazi, in the sense that he's committing Nazi-like crimes, then you cannot face the reality of politics in the United States or policy making on a global scale. Because there's something in your mind which we have to bring forth and straighten out, an assumption which prevents you from facing the truth. Therefore, can your judgment be trusted on anything if you don't fix that problem? Your carburetor isn't functioning. Your ignition is out. The car won't run. Fix the ignition. Fix the problem. And therefore, the first objective here is a psychological one, is to evangelize the people, the voters of the United States, to come to their senses, to exhibit a willingness to understand a principle which we once thought was deeply embossed in our conscience with the Nuremberg trials, a principle which we flaunt as if it had never been known today. And once we do that, once we fix that, then and only then can you trust the American people. Not until. Now let's look at some of the things that contribute to this process. Again, let's go back to the 1920s and 1930s. Let's go back in this century. We had a number of presidents after the Civil War who were advocates, passionate believers in what is sometimes called the lost cause, i.e. the Confederacy. This is a movement which is based today around Nashville. It can be heard in every country music song where people get up there and sing about themselves as being the lost cause, which is the characteristic of the country and western song. I am a lost cause. Let me tell you my story. The Nashville movement, the fugitive movement, the Agrarian Society, the Southern Partisan, Robert Penn Waring, the racist, Nashville. Exemplars of that included Grover Cleveland, who got to be president. Considered a great reformer. He contributed to destroying the country. You have to remember the Democratic Party during most of the 19th century was the party of treason, which it continued to be until Roosevelt, essentially, in the 20th century. That up until the assassination of Woodrow Wilson by Emma Goldman, using her deployed assassin, Emma Goldman, the dear admirer of Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican Party in this country, the party at last of Mark Hanna and McKinley, maintained the Lincoln tradition and was the patriotic party of the nation. Right? Then what was Teddy Roosevelt? Well, Teddy Roosevelt's uncle, who was his mentor, who trained him for politics, who shaped his conscience as a boy and a young man, was James Bullock. James Bullock was famous in the history of the southern states as a leading filibuster who attempted the invasion of Cuba, and then went on to London, where he was the chief of the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Confederacy during the Civil War. Teddy Roosevelt's mother was his sister. He trained Teddy Roosevelt in his politics. Teddy Roosevelt was a representative of the Southern partisan. He was a representative of the lost cause. He had a member of the Bonaparte family, that is the brothers of Napoleon and sisters of Napoleon Bonaparte, except Caroline, who remained in Europe, came to the United States. They became living in New Jersey and also in the southern states, along with the Marat family, which was intermarried, which was part of the same tribe. They became an integral part of the Confederacy, or what became the Confederacy, the Southern Slaveholders Party. And Teddy Roosevelt's foreign minister at one point, and then Attorney General, the guy who gave you the FBI, was Charles Bonaparte, a member of that family, a party steeped in treason. The entire Teddy Roosevelt administration, with a few odd exceptions, was a party of treason. It was a party of Jim Crow. Then, with Teddy Roosevelt's help, we got another creep in there called Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the man who, from the White House, launched the second coming of the Ku Klux Klan in America in 1915 with the sponsorship from the White House of a film produced by Goldwyn and sold by Mayer called The Klansman, otherwise known as The Birth of a Nation, whose sequel was Gone with the Wind. This film was publicly blessed from the White House by a man who was a deep admirer and a family member of the Ku Klux Klan of the 19th century, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson of the Ku Klux Klan. He was insane. He got off crimes against humanity on grounds of insanity. So the Democrat and Republican Party in this century were filthy, racist trash from the top. As they say, fish stinks from the head. Until Roosevelt, in the middle of the 1930s, changed it and rallied this nation to cultural optimism. There is deeply embedded in our culture that kind of tradition, that corruption of the lost cause of the Southern partisan. Now remember that when Woodrow Wilson recruited the revival of the Klan, which he did to get German Catholics, that's what the Klan was used for, to get German Jews hounded, and anyone who didn't admire the British monarchy, generally, because Woodrow Wilson's passion, like Teddy Roosevelt, was to get the United States not only to create the Federal Reserve System, which is what his project and Roosevelt's were, not only to get the income tax law through, which is part of the Federal Reserve package, that is to get money to pay the debt on the federal debt that was going to be created by the Federal Reserve System, but also to get the United States fully committed to war on the side of Britain in Europe, which was the precondition for the British going to war. Without American support, they couldn't have pulled it off. Logistical support and then military support. That became our culture. We abandoned our tradition until Roosevelt reawakened it under conditions of war. And Roosevelt understood, if you read his writings and work, he understood that the British were the problem. Roosevelt was determined at the end of war to eliminate colonialism from the face of this planet, to dissolve the British, French, Dutch, and other colonial empires, to eliminate British economics, that is the Adam Smith system, and to make the world free and safe for the American system, emphasizing investment at low interest rates in long-term and medium-term economic development, especially for the liberation, the economic liberation of countries which have been under the slavery of colonialism. Roosevelt unfortunately died. His successor, Truman, who was a complete patsy for the Harriman interests, which were actually fronts for the British royal family financially since the 1890s, controlled the administration under the so-called the brightest and the best, or the brainiest. And they controlled the Truman administration. And they dropped 2 bombs on Japan totally unnecessarily. No reason to do so. The reason we dropped 2 was because we only had 2. If we'd had 3, we'd have dropped 3. Japan had already effectively surrendered. The emperor had surrendered to Roosevelt, agreed to terms of surrender, through the Vatican, through the Minister of Extraordinary Affairs for the Vatican, or the Secretary of State. Roosevelt had accepted that. MacArthur had understood it. Japan could not possibly resist. There was never an intention to send a single U.S. soldier to invade the main islands of Japan. No need to do so. The naval blockade had cut Japan off. It couldn't live. It was simply a matter of a short time before the entire Japan economy and military would collapse as a result of the naval blockade. We simply had to sit back and wait until the Japan military accepted the emperor's terms of surrender to the United States. Incidentally, the same terms which were actually imposed upon Japan after the surrender did occur to MacArthur. We began the nuclear age. And I remember, I came back. We, who were in the service, and some of you remember it because you were also in the service, came back from overseas. We were full of optimism, particularly after VE Day. We were full of optimism. We had come out of a terrible depression. From 1939 to 1943, we had made a gigantic leap forward in economy. We had rebuilt the greatest military and industrial machine on this planet, agro-industrial machine, out of the depths of a depression. We had won a war. We were the leaders of the world. Everything was in our hands. We had tremendous optimism that things are possible. The evil, the disgusting things, the racism, all this crap from the past was still there, but it was on the wane. It was in retreat. Then the bombs on Japan was number one. Demoralization. I can tell you that from my personal experience, between the weeks I got on the boat to return and a few weeks or so into somewhere in 1946, the typical veteran who served with me had gone from optimism to pessimism. Joe McCarthy did not create McCarthyism. The Truman administration did. I saw it happen. I was there. The frightened American thrown back into a depression, economic depression of 1946 through 48, became demoralized. He and his wife, he'd lost some years in the war, typically, had to make up for lost time, getting a family started, need to buy a house, need an automobile. There's a depression on, job insecurity. Don't get into trouble. Keep your nose clean. Don't become involved. Do whatever is necessary to hold on to economic security for your family. Your family comes first. Protect your family. Protect your job. Protect your career. Eventually became sell anybody, turn anybody in, knife anybody in the back. Do whatever is necessary. Keep your nose clean. Stay out of trouble. Look this way. Look that way. If it could get you into trouble, don't say it. If it might get you in trouble, don't even think it. Say whatever you're supposed to say. Along came later Joe McCarthy, and the public was ready for him. The Truman administration and the interval from 1946, from the dropping of the bombs into the 1949, had completely destroyed the morality and morale of most of my generation of Americans. We were a nation of cultural pessimists. We stunk. Oh yes, there are a few good people around, but they could never seem to get the job done right because the impetus wasn't there to do the job. Then along came Kennedy. And then came Martin Luther King, this miracle, Martin Luther King, who from his first public speech as a minister newly elected to a post showed his mettle. And Kennedy, the space program, the taking on of the steel barons and other things of that sort, and this reinvigorated our country. Into the middle of the 1960s, there was a certain degree of optimism. Then a great betrayal, the Vietnam War, the shutdown of our space program. all these other things. We became demoralized again. And it was introduced under the cover of war. Remember that most of you people who had children, baby boomer generation, who are baby boomers, you came from families which are of my generation. Families in which 90% or more of the cases were stinking cowards. I can say that. I'm a member of the generation. I looked at the eyes of my friends, of fellow veterans and others. They were stinking cowards, moral cowards, unwilling to stand up for truth, willing to lie, willing to say anything to get by and get ahead. There was no real morality. They were stinking cowards. There was some goodness in my people, but they were stinking cowards, all the same, and willing to do all kinds of immoral things to get ahead. And they raised children, the children of stinking cowards. Now let's focus on one part of that population. The suburbanite child of a family which was not poor during the 1950s, which focused on success in career, which made money, probably lived in suburbia, affected certain manners and so forth, belonged to country clubs and whatnot, and could afford to send their children and assist to get them into a college. And the Vietnam War came along, and we had them on college. And what did we have? We had the children of stinking, spoiled brats who were children of stinking cowards, who had been the McCarthyites by and large, at least until the Army McCarthy hearings. From Truman's time until then. I was there, I remember. Some of you were there. You remember too. We saw it. And on the television screen, the president had been killed. Malcolm X was killed later. That was a ripple in some circles. Martin Luther King's killing was a big ripple. The killing of Bobby Kennedy a couple of months after King's killing made it a big ripple. But on the screen every night, regular as clockwork, the television news showed you bodies of Americans of your age, if you were that college generation, looking horrible, not pretty at all. Not the kind of pre-arranged funeral service you'd like to buy. And the mind of this person, of this cowardly, immoral parents, stinking cowardly parents, looked at that. That could be me. And along came, well, what do you do? Well, have some free sex. Take your mind off it. With whom? With anything. That doesn't work. Well, take some drugs with it. Try some LSD. Maybe a little marijuana with wine on the way down. That'd probably keep your mind off it. Fix your head. I've got a problem in my head. That doesn't work. Well, go to an all-night rock concert. The beat of that beat will drive any thoughts out of your mind. You won't even know who you are when you walk out of there. With a little sex and LSD added in. That became the cultural paradigm shift. The youth counterculture core launched on campuses of this country during the middle of the 1960s in response to this sudden change. The killing of Kennedy, the death of optimism, other assassinations which are not covered. And that demoralized us. Now what happened? What happened to us, both in the course of World War I, in that period, until Roosevelt, and what happened to us again, partly in the post-war period, but clicked in the middle of the 1960s, was a phenomenon called cultural pessimism, a phenomenon which is famously known in Europe in the post-World War I period as the conservative revolution. The movement of conservatism throughout Europe, which gave you, among other things, Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany. And other phenomena of various degrees shading into the same thing. The British League of Fascists and so forth, the whole kit and caboodle. So out of pessimism and immorality in the United States, as in Europe, there came a conservative revolution. I lived through it in the 1920s. I remember people of our country were evil in the 1920s because of this conservative revolution. They were evil somewhat like people today are evil, who will vote for Gingrich, where Gingrich is tolerated. Similar things are tolerated. Evil. In Germany, in France, in Italy, the same thing. Under conditions of pessimism, we saw what depravity people could sink to when they become pessimistic, when they become conservative, which means it's time to put them in a bottle with a suitable preservative. It happened again with us at the end of the war. It happened to us in the middle of the 1960s. We are living in the long conservative wave of the conservative revolution in America once again, which has, again, the same characteristic features but in an American style. Sort of like, you know, it's like a monster of a mammal monster being reproduced in a marsupial. It's an American political conservative. Same form. The dire wolves of America. This conservatism. That is Gingrich. Now go back into the middle of the 1960s and you can locate this precisely. You had on the one hand, you had the upsweep. You had Martin Luther King. What was Martin Luther King? Optimism. Rebuild America. Reaffirm the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Reaffirm the goals of the preamble of the Constitution. The freedom of African Americans is the key to the rebirth of America in its dedication to what it was intended to be. A great movement. Now, what was deployed against it? Apart from Roy Cohn's friends, what was deployed against it was black nationalism, funded by the Ford Foundation and similar, which was targeted right in the middle of the civil rights movement, including Stokely Carmichael's deployment into Alabama at a crucial point around Selma. Deployed, government agents deployed, or foundation agents, which are the same things, worse than government agents, deployed to destroy the civil rights movement with the aid of black nationalism. The same thing is being attempted today to try to destroy the effect of the Million Man March. A unifying event is destroyed by a disunifying event, by some militant fanatic who says it's not good enough, we got to go all the way. That happened. But then with this other movement came along, what came? Post-industrial society. An old oligarchical trick. This is the tradition of Babylon. No, scientific and technological progress is the reason for war. That was the argument. Therefore, we have to stop scientific and technological progress. We have to get back to nature. We consume too much. We've got to consume less. And the radical ideas of the 60s became, out of the drug circuit, became the drug epidemic on the secondary school level, then got down in the 70s into the primary school level, and also became the Rainbow Coalition, became the environmentalist movement. We are now destroyed as a national economy. The world economy is being destroyed as a result of what? Which I recognized when I was teaching on campus back in 1967-68. That what I was looking at that was called the left was actually the far right. That Mark Rudd and what he represented were the Mussolinis of 1968. It was a conservative movement, a reactionary movement, a movement against progress, a movement against optimism, a movement for pessimism. Look at our universities today. Look at the philosophy departments. What is taught? What is accepted in the philosophy departments? You'll be shocked. Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. What is Nietzsche? Nietzsche is fascism. He's Nazism. Don't anybody tell you different. They'll say differently, but it's not true. He is Nazism. He is the prophet of Nazism. He's the Antichrist. He's the force of destruction. He is Dionysius by his own profession. Who is Martin Heidegger? Martin Heidegger was a Nazi official, a Nazi party official, Hitler's official Nietzschean philosopher in Germany. Heidegger. You have similar forms of existentialism in France around Jean-Paul Sartre and others. You have the radical version of that around Jacques Derrida today, a man of Hungarian extraction who's now teaching under George Soros's patronage at the university in Budapest of the Soros Foundation. These things are being taught as the recommended course, the recommended world outlook in the philosophy departments of typical American universities. What is this? This is Nazism. Go back again to the 1960s. What was the reaction of the Republican Party to the civil rights movement? Very simple. And if you understand how things work, you understand exactly how they did it. The lost cause. It was called the Southern Strategy. There were a lot of racist characters who were running as Democrats in the southern states, who really were non-dues paying members of the Ku Klux Klan, to all intents and purposes, including boll weevils, as they later became, who joined the Republican Party without stopping at moderate Republican and went directly to fascist. They jumped Democrats, Southern Democrats, who jumped out of the Democratic Party into the Republican Party and became the most extreme fascists in the Republican Party. Typified by that degenerate, that draft dodger by the name of Phil Gramm, the senile from Texas. He teaches economics because he couldn't learn anything, but needed to go to school. Then you got the rest of them. I know these guys. I've met them. I met them in 1979, 1980. I looked at them. I wondered, what kind of animals are these things? Talk to them. They're supposed to be Democrats. And you get the smell of what's underneath the surface. You get that smell. Oh, boy. I know what I mean. Then the Democrats, with Southern Leadership Organization, got into the same thing. What's the problem today in the Democratic Party? I'll just conclude on this one note, on this theme. The case of Dirty Dick Morris. Right? Now, Dirty Dick Morris's father is Eugene Morris. When Dirty Dick Morris's father was a boy, there was a breakup in the marriage, and he went to live with Roy Cohn's family. He was raised by Al Cohn, and Roy Cohn, in effect, was the younger brother of Eugene Morris, who's now about 87 years of age. And Eugene made a lot of money in things like tax lien sales and things like that. He helped people who were engaged in what we call the wise guys. They had some money and they wanted to launder it, and he would find the ways to take care of the thing through real estate deals. Now, this crowd has to be understood. This crowd was essentially under the control of Tom Dewey. And Tom Dewey was a creation of the Dulles brothers. If you look at the killing of Kennedy, and you look in this current edition of EIR that's out there, I believe now, you'll find that the people who were in the organization, including Roy Cohn, which was identified by Garrison as killing Kennedy, were controlling influences on the Warren Commission. Rankin was part of it. Roy Cohn had a piece of the action of the Leonel Corporation, which was a front for Permindex. Permindex, remember, was the organization which my friend Rabault Delon was hunting down because they were out to kill de Gaulle in France in the early 1960s. It was an organization which was engaged in mass murder, political murders in Italy, under another cover. It was headed by Colonel, up in Canada, Colonel Mortimer Bloomfield, who was personnel advisor to Gay Edgar Hoover from 1938 to 1963 for the MI5 relationship to Division 5 of the FBI. This is the kind of operation. Now, what does Dick Morris represent? If you look in Loudoun County and adjoining counties in Virginia, you will see the answer. I'll teach you how to slice a melon. There's a fellow down there called Sir Paul Mellon, who is the doyen of the Mellon family, I believe. He's in his 80s. He breeds horses. I guess he couldn't succeed with children. And he's very closely associated with the Queen of England, who stops at his airstrip when she passes through this country on her way to George Bush's financial angel Farish for the horse breeding farm over there nearby. This whole crowd here, they're all, you think this was a country parish of the British royal family. And it is. From Alexandria to Winchester, that whole strip across there is dominated by a bunch of families who aren't Americans. They're all parts of the British Empire. They breed horses when they can succeed, when they can make it. You have the Guest family, Winston Churchill's family. You have the crazy DuPonts, the ones who believe in eugenics, the Hitler supporters from the back of the 1920s and 1930s. A real collection of creeps, oligarchical creeps. And you look at it, and the Harrimans. You look at it carefully. What do you got? What you have is the horse-breeding crowd of the pre-World War I period around Long Island and New York State and so forth, which used to have these hunt country operations out in, before they sold the potato patch on Long Island to Bill Levittown. Right? That had places out there. Then you had, and up in lower New York State, that had these vast estates, like British estates, like Lindisfarne, something like that. And they began to move and colonize down to the south, like carpetbaggers, to strike up their affinities with those families which represented the Confederate tradition. And you'll find that you have the conservative movement in America, which Roy Cohn represented, for example, in New York City. Neoconservatism of the type which you find in this guy Gingrich actually was fulminated, so to speak, around Roy Cohn and his friends and J. Edgar Hoover's friends back in those days. And this spread. And you have the northern conservative, that is in the tradition of the opium trader, family of New England, Connecticut, and so forth, in bed with those who represent the tradition of the lost cause. There was that kind of relationship. Roy Cohn in bed with Robert Penn Warren. And you've got it. So what we have in the country, in the toleration and the popularity, for something that smells like this, you have the kind of thing which we see in studies in Europe of the conservative revolution of the 1920s and 1930s. That many ordinary people displaying the kind of moral cowardice and intellectual cowardice I saw my fellow veterans in the late 1940s. That kind of cowardice of take care of your own, take care of your family. Watch out for this, watch out for that. Keep your nose clean, keep your head straight. Don't get into trouble. Don't say the wrong thing. Be careful to say the approved things. Watching the news media, yapping, 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 yapping. Babbling things where they have no understanding of. You got to balance the budget, you got to balance the budget. All these slogans, mindless slogan mouthing. That what you have is this phenomenon in America is a bunch of suckers who, with the aid of the entertainment media and the news media, are suckered into a movement which is like a disease, like an epidemic disease, called the conservative revolution by its proper name. This has gobbled up and corrupted the minds of Americans. If we do not free the American people from the grip of that American form, the Ku Klux Klan adapted form, the American form of the conservative movement which we know otherwise in Europe, then this nation, which is the greatest power still on this planet, will be destroyed from within. And with what is going on to the rest of this planet, there isn't much chance for it. Therefore, how do we turn it? We, with limited resources, how do you save the nation? You recognize that if you go out there and fight the opinions, door-to-door campaign to change people's opinion, you're not going to succeed. Yes, you have to do door-to-door campaigning, but that by itself is not going to succeed. You have to do something else. You have to address the axiom. And the axiom is very simple. The axiom is in Genesis 1:26 through 30. Man, that means every man and woman, as it says specifically in the, particularly in the King James Authorized Version. Every man and woman is made in the image of God. And is endowed with those qualities by means of which man is assigned dominion in the universe. In the New Testament, the view of Plato on political matters is amplified, particularly in the Gospel of John and in the epistles of Paul. The word in Greek is agape, which appears in Plato in reference to love of truth and love of justice, which is the term which is emphasized by Paul, notably in 1 Corinthians 13. That whatever you do that you think is good is nothing unless it's done with love for truth and love for justice, love for God, love for man. It is as nothing. That is the principle upon which this civilization depends. That every human being is made in the image of God. Every man and woman is given that, in within them, that divine potentiality by which we can achieve dominion over this universe. We are united by love of truth and justice. Okay? We are united by the fact that we are creatures of ideas who inherit the wisdom bestowed to us from thousands of years before, as we are able in a decent educational process. Each child is capable of knowing those things, or at least many of them. We are tied to the generations to come hundreds and thousands of years from now by what we do with the talent which is given to us, and what we make of it when we return it before we die, which is a benefit, or the foundation of benefits, which will be acquired by our descendants hundreds and thousands of years hence. And therefore, our function, the reality of our existence, which is short enough indeed, is that we need education, universal education, for every child. Not education to do a job, but education to be a citizen in the true sense of humanity. To participate in the past, to be connected to the future efficiently by the gifts which we are trained to make to society. Our ability to transmit the ideas which are precious to us, to others around us, and to our descendants and their descendants. That we have the ability to improve the condition of mankind by using this knowledge and the power to develop it, to increase the productive powers of labor, to continue to enhance life expectancy, to make life better. An unending process of improvement in which we can look at every person about us as someone who is potentially capable of making that contribution if they are given the education and if they're given the opportunity to utilize that education to mankind's benefit. Don't worry about the details, worry about the axioms. We must return this nation, the conscience of its people, and the foreign policy of this nation to that principle. And we must recognize that in the conservative revolution, in what Gingrich represents, what Tom Ridge represents, we're seeing Faust. We're seeing the smoke of the devil himself. And when we recognize that that is evil, it is not something to be treated as somebody's different opinion. But this is, by all moral standards, a crime against humanity. That this argument is not one of first impression, but this is an opinion, a judgment which has been well established before us, and which those of our generation should know, which our institutions should know, that anyone who does what contract with America would do with America, what anyone does who would apply that foreign policy, that same principle as foreign policy to other nations, is guilty of a crime against humanity. And we must be conscious that that is a crime and attend to it to see that our government and relative institutions are not permitted to commit that crime anymore. That we do not commit that crime in our domestic affairs, we do not tolerate here, we do not tolerate it in our foreign affairs. And that's why what I'm doing about Ridge. It's not that I'm singling him out. I am, but I'm according to the principle of warfare of les économes. The American people must come to the point that they recognize as an axiom which has to be fixed. And the axiom, which is the difference between being criminals and being what we're supposed to be. And once we make that clear and say, here he is. Here is this man who some in that Republican Party would make the vice presidential candidate. Here's a man who belongs in the dock with Hitler's crowd. And you want to make him vice president? You can't call him a Nazi. See? There's the point. And that's the way I believe, because man is a creature of ideas, not just of muscle. But you have to fight the great strategic battles with ideas, not just opinions, but ideas respecting those axiomatic assumptions which govern the way we make our opinions and choose our behavior. There's an axiom at fault in our culture, and we have to fix it. Thank you. Like that?
Okay, we have a microphone set up for very short people. They're gonna fix the microphone. We do have a microphone set up. Mr. LaRouche is prepared to answer questions. I would ask that as you step up to the microphone before you ask your question, if possible, please identify yourself and we'll get your questions answered.
No.
Charles, you going to do something with that mic? Why don't you come on up? Go do something.
Charles, what are you doing?
Ask a question here.
You would ask people to beg for answers? Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, good.
My name is Dr. George Sviatov. I am from Russia. And I was very impressed with your publications and with your today's speech. I'd like to ask you such a question. In February 1917, in Russia, the second bourgeois democratic revolution took place. And allegedly, it was the result of Masons' activity, because almost all the first provisional government was consist of distinguished Masons. In 1991, in the Soviet Union, the third bourgeois democratic revolution took place. What is your opinion? Which clandestine forces, if they existed, played this role for the third bourgeois democratic revolution in Russia, which, as a result, led to disintegration of the power? Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, it might be called clandestine, but it wasn't clandestine to me in either case, especially in the latter case. Because what is clandestine is what people usually refuse to see, which is plainly in the open. For example, my view of the second event, the 1991 event, is colored by the fact that, which is reported at some length in the publication of the EIR, which is out there, on the SDI question. I could make it short because the details are there. But because I understood the idiocy, the strategic idiocy which dominated the world in the post-war period, that whereas Roosevelt was determined to use his relationship with Stalin and with China as great powers to break the power of the colonial powers in the post-war period, that the British smartly used the opportunity of Roosevelt's death to create a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, and also to make a mess of China, thus creating a traditional Roman imperial kind of balance of power between East and West. And you forget the details of the East and West, what the details of the conflict, because there were largely a lot of complications in there. But the essential thing is if you can prevent Eurasia from uniting for economic cooperation from the Atlantic to the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, and prevent that from occurring with the cooperation of the United States, you can control the world. Not necessarily as a British empire in the geographical sense, even though that still exists, but as a British empire, as an international financier, oligarchical interest which dominates the world today through Royal Dutch Shell, British Petroleum, et cetera, right? And the financial institutions behind them. So that the way they did that, the way this worked was to drop the bombs on Japan, which created a nuclear conflict. And so therefore, even though the Soviet Union was already developing a nuclear weapon from about 1940 under the atom projects started by Vernadsky and his protege Kurchatov, that the Russians were afraid to use their own design because they were afraid Stalin would kill them if it didn't work. So they were happy to take the stolen design given to them by the British from the American design to use for the first thing, and then the Kurchatov used his own design, or the Russian-Soviet design, for the second weapon. All right, so what the British did, as Russell laid it out, it was no secret. There's nothing clandestine. It was open. Okay? To use nuclear weapons, an idea which H.G. Wells formulated at the end of World War I. To take nuclear weapons, as explained to him as a possibility by Frederick Soddy, who was the collaborator of Rutherford, a Canadian who collaborated with the Rutherford. To use nuclear weapons as a weapon so terrible that nation states would give up their sovereignty rather than go to war with such weapons around. And that was Russell's plan, was the nuclear age would make war so horrible that nations would submit to arbitration of various forms rather than go to war. And thus the arbitration agency, ultimately the United Nations, as Russell put it in 1946, would become the world government and the sovereignty of nations would disappear. So the problem was that we faced, as I saw it, especially in the 1970s, the problem we faced, we had to break the agreement, the 1972 SALT and ABM agreements. Because as long as the world was under blackmail of thermonuclear tipped weapons against which no defense was allowed, then this game could be played. And as long as this game could be played, the world was in danger. So as a result of that, I went to work on developing what became known as the SDI. The way the SDI was developed is I was engaged by the United States government or agency of the government to conduct a back-channel discussion, exploratory nature talks, with the Soviet government. And I proposed that we discuss this question of strategic ballistic missile defense as a point of possible agreement between the two governments to bypass these SALT ABM agreements and to get out of this bind. Yeah? And that we use that jointly and openly to launch a worldwide economic boom, a technology boom, by taking the products of this research and making them available for general economy, and thus get a worldwide economic recovery in progress. Many people in the Soviet Union were interested in that. There was agreement on every point I made on the technology and how it would work. No disagreement. But Andropov and others turned it down. Now, I understood what the problem was. Because it was very clear. There were people like the Bush people, James Baker III in the United States was opposed to that, tried to sabotage it, as Bush did. Kissinger was, of course, against it. A lot of Democrats were against it. On the Soviet side, Andropov and his crowd were against it, even though many Soviet officials agreed that I had diagnosed the problem, what the crisis was, and that this might be a solution. Right. Then came after the Soviets, after Andropov died, they had a problem where they had to pick a dead man for General Secretary. And then when the Queen of England approved of Mikhail Gorbachev and his wife, then they could let Chernenko get off the machine and die, and then Gorbachev became General Secretary. And I recognized from the beginning that Gorbachev was trouble, real trouble. And what happened, of course, was that we, instead of avoiding the crisis we're in now, which we could have, we ended up with Gorbachev, who is funded by Henry Kissinger's friends in the United States, as well as run from England. Gorbachev and his people orchestrated every step from the inside, together with certain institutions of the Soviet intelligence service, which I won't name, but I could name, which are more British than they ever were Russian. And these people from the inside, some of them bought, so forth, actually orchestrated this event in that way. Also from the other side, the Anglo-French, Entente Cordiale, together with Bush, George Bush, were determined to prevent what I've worked for. My view is that the inevitable collapse of the Soviet system, which was clear to me at the time we were having the discussions, that at that point we would have to resort with a Food for Peace program or economic cooperation to try to reorient and do exactly what the British had tried to prevent, to create a continental cooperation on economic development on Eurasia with U.S. sponsorship. Bush's people put me in jail to keep that thing out of the way, and that then proceeded with their proposal. And they had in place inside the Soviet Union, they had people like Gorbachev and many others who were instruments of their policy, who had sold out their country, didn't care about their country anymore. What they cared about was themselves and their careers and their future. The ship is sinking, I'm going to get on the next ship that passes by. That's the way it goes.
Mr. LaRouche, my name is Al Sambuco, and I've been following your work for about a year, and I'm in this local area. My question has to do with the economy. I understand that one of the big items, the biggest item, is the sale and exchange of derivatives. And you've pointed out how that could eventually cause the destruction of our economy and the world economy thereof. Could you give a brief explanation of the mechanics of how that sale and exchange detracts from the productive economy?
Well, first of all, the derivatives is a pure speculation. It's something that would be too illegal to be allowed in Las Vegas. It's too risky. That is, what it is the nature of side bets, and then becomes side bets on side bets, and then you get side bets on the side bets on the side bets. Right? So people are making bets, hedges they call them. They're bets. So what you have, you've got to a point that of the total foreign exchange daily in the world, about 99.5% of that turnover is attributable to speculation, financial transactions of that type, as opposed to trade today. Deadly. Now what you're seeing now on the markets is not a stock market crisis, is not a bond market crisis, it's a banking crisis, and it's a derivatives crisis. And the way, sometimes the way something dies such as the way it was living. Yeah? Like the drunk who dies of cirrhosis. That what is happening is there's a shortage of cash in the banking system. And they're just to get how this works. Forget all the stories that you get on the wall, because people don't like to talk about the real problem. Like say, well, I've got a deadly disease. What is it? Well, it's a disease. And it makes me feel uncomfortable, right? I might die of it, but it makes me feel uncomfortable. They don't like to talk about reality. Point is, what is the cash shortage mean? That the way this works is it works on what's called financial leverage. That is, you actually paid in amount is only a small percent of the total nominal value of the whole transaction. But of course, if it goes bankrupt, you have to pay the full amount. So therefore, you have to keep paying in the small amounts to stoke the fires to keep the big one from collapsing on you. And if this collapses, believe me, nobody will ever figure it out. No one will ever, if this collapse occurs, no one will ever settle the account. It cannot be done. There are too many invisible off-balance sheet transactions involved. And also there's a lot of drug trafficking going on. Billions, tens of billions of dollars of drug trafficking, illegal weapons trafficking. I mean, things people don't like to talk about, you know, all involved in this stuff, as well as organized crime. All right, so what happens is, in order to keep the bubble going, you have to get at the bottom, as I explained in January, in the first broadcast I did, the January 15th address on the Martin Luther King Day, birthday here, is you have to keep stoking this with cash. A small margin of cash, which is leverage, which is necessary to keep the whole thing bubble going. Now what means, as the bubble gets bigger, the absolute amount of cash, even though it's small in percent required, gets enormous. The cash has to be supplied largely by central banks, or through the leverage of central banks. The cash comes from what? The cash comes from pension funds, mutual funds, so forth and so on, which loot their accounts in order to engage in financial transactions. They squeeze rents, they squeeze this, they squeeze taxes, they squeeze government accounts. Everything is squeezed. Everything is mortgaged up the hill and looted. The piggy bank is broken and robbed in order to get more cash to put in this racket. It's like the great tulip bulb scandal speculation in the Netherlands in the 17th century. or it's a wild version of the John Law bubbles of the early 18th century. Just a complete bubble. And cash has to keep coming into that thing. Where does the cash come from? Well, cash is money. The creation of money is a charge against the economy. Charge against the government is a charge against the economy. So the economy has to be looted. Grandmother has to be sold. Grandfather has to have his operation cut because the cash is needed. Grandfather's just going to have to die. We need that money for cash to keep the bubble going. So therefore what's happened was inevitable. This kind of policy has the effect of collapsing, accelerating the rate of collapse of the real economy. Salaries are down. Look in Germany, look in Europe. One firm after the other, which were the famous firms of Europe, are collapsing. They're keeling over, one after the other. Leading firms, leading businesses of the world are collapsing one after the other, or being gobbled up, and their shells are being collapsed. Don't believe this propaganda out of the White House, this election propaganda. The economy is sick. It takes 10 jobs to support a family. So a lot more jobs. One isn't enough anymore. You need 10 of them. And then they still don't make it. Everything is being destroyed. Look at the water system in Washington, D.C. Old pipes. What? Why aren't they replaced? Didn't have the cash. Had to put the cash in the bubble. New York, other cities, infrastructure collapsing. Look at the CSX. Look at the train wrecks. Look at the value jet phenomenon, and so forth and so on. Everything is stripped to the bone and looted. Grandma's hot. Grandfather's operation is postponed, so he has to die. Can't afford a real casket. We need the cash for the bubble. So therefore, what is the breaking point of this bubble, which reveals its characteristic? The breaking point is where the cash shortage is. And what is happening, as Camdessus said openly on the eve of the G7 conference in Lyon, France, several weeks ago, we are looking at a banking crisis, not a bond crisis, not a stock market crisis, not a commodities market crisis. We're looking at a banking crisis. What does a banking crisis mean? It means that cash in the system ain't there to keep the banking system going. Why? Because the banking system has not the means to finance a bubble on whose existence the banking system itself has now become mortgaged. The French banking system, the German banking system, the British banking system, the American banking system are all essentially doomed right now. And what you're seeing is the onset of a process where that doom is inevitable. What's the reaction? You see it on the other side. What are the monkeys doing who know? I'm speaking about Prince Philip and Company. What are these monkeys doing? In anticipation, don't they know this is happening? Of course they know it's happening. What are they doing about it? They telling you about it? No, of course not. What are they doing about it? Not what are they saying about it. What they've been doing about it for about 18 months or so is buying gold, platinum, getting the central banks to keep the price of gold down while they buy it up in great quantities. Gold mines, platinum mines, all precious metals, silver. Food, international food trade. Over 50% is controlled from London through the international food cartel. Strategic minerals, guess who controls those? Same thing. Who controls 50% approximately of the world's turnover? It's the London market as augmented by Hong Kong, Singapore, and so forth, control the over 50% of the world's turnover, as they do 65% of the world's precious metals trade. Who controls the majority of the international trade in natural gas and petroleum, and so forth and so on? Who has been buying up bankrupt farms for a song at tax lien prices? Who's been buying up every asset imaginable at the bottom price? These guys who know the financial system is finished. The banking system is probably going to go. What have they done? They have bought assets. Control of the substances upon which human life largely depends in order to attempt to control the world in the post-crash period. What we're now is in a convergence, which we don't know what this thing is going to lead to. But what you're seeing on the markets is not a stock market crisis, not a bond market crisis. Forget that. That's all double talk. And wishful thinking by people who don't want to admit what the problem is. They're scared. You know, Some guys, you get some financial analyst who's got a little money tucked away in a bank someplace, and they think that's going to be their future. And they're going to do anything to get themselves and you to believe that it's not the banking system, it's just a stock market or a bond market aberration. Oh, they got an insurance policy, they got this, they got that. They've got nothing. Nobody has anything except those mighty powers that control these assets. And the question is a political question. Are you going to let them do it to you? And what can you do about it? Which is what we're putting to the test in Pennsylvania on this tax. Can they take away your life in order to sustain their system, which is what Tom Ridge is doing for the melons? Killing people to take the gold teeth out of their bodies to support the melons who own him. Pure and simple, that's what he's doing. He is nothing but a dirty, murderous lackey for the melons. Elsie Hillman's stooge. Right? What power do you have to stop them? You're a little weak individual. You have one power. It's called government. The institutions of sovereign government. If government, what government says, because remember, financial agreements, property titles, all of these kinds of things are political fictions. They do not exist without an enforcement to make them exist. They don't exist by contract. Forget this contract theory here. Doesn't mean a thing. In the revolution, the paper gets burned. Where's the contract? The other party doesn't agree, shoot them. Where's the contract? The heirs come along, you know what to do about them. Right? In the crisis, the value and authority of political fictions depends entirely upon the will of government. If the people control the government, then the right can be done. Then they can't steal your food. Then they can't take away your home. Because natural law provisions, higher concerns, under the general welfare clause of the preamble of our Constitution, dictates that Congress must make laws which ensure the general welfare. And when the general welfare is in jeopardy, it is the power of the government to make laws to ensure this protected. So what do? We say, we are not going to save the system. We are going to do what we would do with the Oshkosh Savings and Loan Bank if it went under. We're going to put it through financial reorganization. Government-sponsored, supervised financial reorganization. We're going to try to protect the depositors as much as we can. We're going to try to prevent social chaos and economic chaos from coming out of the bankruptcy. We are going to create alternative means with a new currency issue, with new banking arrangements, with new economic recovery programs to ensure that we protect the general welfare as the preamble of our federal Constitution mandates we must do. And that's our only defense. And that's the reality. What is happening must be seen as a collapse of a rotten, decayed, Venetian-style speculative system. And the issue is, what are we going to do about it? It's already collapsing. You've got the warning signs. You don't need any more warning signs. Will governments, especially the government of the United States as the leading power of the planet, exert the responsibility and authority given to our federal government by the general welfare clause of the preamble of our Constitution? And will we take such judicious action as is necessary to protect our people, our nation, and peoples of other nations from the effect of the greatest financial collapse in all human existence? It's happening now. Just like the Ridge case. You've got to get people to see the reality of this thing. Stop being wishful. See the reality and be prepared to act politically to support a government which will implement the general welfare clause. It's in collapsing right now. When it really collapses, it's too late, so-called, because that means, look, this thing goes within 24 to 72 hours in a reverse Markov process, a chain reaction, like a chemical explosion, but an implosion. The entire world financial system can disintegrate, not go bankrupt, disintegrate. It just isn't there. Because the people who had the premises have fled because there's nothing they can do about it. They can't pay any bills, they have no assets, the whole thing. Money doesn't mean anything anymore. currency is no longer negotiable. We've seen that locally in military and other situations before. But on a global scale, you can have a situation in which virtually no currency has any value. It's not negotiable because it has no power, no political power. So the question is now, it's like with the Rich campaign and things like that, to take this action to get the American people and others to face the reality of the problem. Because there are solutions if we will recognize the problem. Then we will not say, well, we can't do that, we can't do that, we can't do that. We got to do that. And then we can solve the problem. The sooner the better. We should put this thing through reorganization right now, not wait. The problem is the political will to do so doesn't exist. I think the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, would do it, but he doesn't have the political will to do it. So we have to supply the will. To recognize he's got to do it. If I told Bill Clinton that, he'd say, probably I agree with you, but they'd kill me if I tried.
Okay, next question from the microphone.
Name is Mark Walker from the Norfolk area in Virginia. What struck me as you were talking is that there is an assumption that people know who Hitler is and what things are done in Nazi Germany. I am a school teacher. I don't teach in the classroom, I teach the casualties, and many of them coming out. Basically, many of the students I've taught over the years do not know who Hitler is. They have no idea what Nazi Germany is. They have very little bit of history. Some of the basic things, the Civil War, they know very little about. And most importantly, they do not demonstrate anything concerning thinking. Okay. It would be helpful, I would think, for parents, starting in this room, to inventory what their children know and what they know as well. That might be quite useful. But the question I have concerning all this, obviously a lot has to be done quickly in order for us to save our hides, to be blunt. What ideas do you have to kind of penetrate this new age of brainwashing the kids have had?
First of all, I think you could attest, if you must know, that these children today of the, shall we call them the Z generation, the children of Generation X, like their X-rated parents, realize that the baby boomers are bums. Their intelligence, perception, goes only to the point, the most primitive level of knowledge. My old man is stupid, which can be a kind of knowledge under certain circumstances. Because if you recognize that you have to change, that's the beginning of wisdom. You know, in the monadology, I've written a piece on this, which will be published or something, on the question of Leibniz viewed from the standpoint of Riemann's work, in which the crucial issue is an understanding which I think very few people have of who study these fields, the monadology of Leibniz. What is a monad? The substance of a monad, as Leibniz says, is change. The beginning of wisdom is the perception that we have to change. Now, if you give me a child who realizes there's something very wrong and things have to be changed, you've got the first condition. Now, you have a second thing that's required, which anyone in military experience knows. You cannot have an army of foot soldiers. You have to have commanders. You have to have leaders. People will move with whom they trust, those who move them. They will move under leadership. Our problem is not the rank and file, because the rank and file is what's given to you. You have to save the nation. You can't wait for the rank and file to catch up and catch all these ideas. You've got to save them. You've got a lifeboat full of people. They're going to die unless you do something. Do you wait for them all to acquire the wisdom to agree on what has to be done? Or do you take leadership to save them and ask for their support to do it? So you have two levels. First of all, you have to recognize, acknowledge the fact, say, yes, you're right. You're right on two things. You realize you don't know anything, and you realize that the older generation wasn't doing too well. That things have to change. Yes, we have to change, and we have to start marching down. But the leadership has the moral responsibility of not imposing arbitrarily just any idea a prejudice has. The responsibility of leadership is a moral one, to be right. That is, least right in the sense of what direction in which to march. A burning building. What's the direction to lead the kiddies out of the burning building? Not to debate what the exit is, but to lead the way out. And to be sure you know what you're doing. And that's the way you have to approach it. Yes, we have to need a whole new school system. But the way we'll get a school system is by getting the kiddies inspired to realize, what are the kiddies getting now? What's your problem? Just look at your kiddie. Television, popular entertainment, recreations, babbling playmates. There's nothing there for the child. Nothing. The school is a fraud. The playmates babble. Nobody knows anything. It's the now generation, it's the me generation, but worse. Just getting through the days, surviving, the moment. The passion of the individual moment. The passion of fear. The passion of insecurity, the passion of doubt. The passion of wondering if you're really human. The passion of knowing wondering whether you have an identity or not. These simple things grip these little kiddies for the most part. You have to say, you don't like it, you have to march them out of there. But you have to do the right thing. You cannot mislead them. So our problem is to develop leaders.
Okay, next question. Presidential candidate Lyndon LaRouche.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you all. Now, this afternoon, you'll discover that Helga recently spent some time in China prior to some other foreign travel. And before that, before she was in China, we were both in Russia. And she will give you some insights into the policy perspective globally we have for dealing with the present international financial and strategic crisis. This morning, I'll address the same crisis from a different standpoint of how we're fighting the battle, the global strategic battle, on the battlefields not of Gettysburg, but of Pennsylvania in general. Now, back in 1793, France, under a terrible government, was overrun by invading armies which were victorious on every front. The word in Paris was that the defeat and consequent dismemberment of France was a military inevitability. At that point, they found a sucker to take over the defense forces of France. His name was Lazare Carnot. He was a rather famous military genius who had once spent time in the Bastille because of court politics, who had been a student of Gaspard Monge, who was the leading scientific thinker of France and at that point of Europe. Lazare Carnot, under conditions of imminent defeat, reorganized the policies, the military policies of France and its armies, often fired major generals to replace them with sergeants quite successfully. If he found the major generals keeping the troops in the barracks too long, or if they didn't cross the river that night rather than waiting for the next morning, things like that, terrible crimes. But a very specific thing which he did, apart from revolutionizing modern warfare by uses of development of mass mobile field artillery fire and things of that sort, was to change the policies of France, that rather than attacking the adversary on a broad front in a kind of federated approach of mass attacks on every front simultaneously, which only a jarhead would do, was to focus the military power of France at each point at certain specific points. And by picking a point on which to attack, to turn the flank of the enemy and rout him. Now that's exactly what we're doing with the campaign in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We have limited forces. We must change the policy of the United States. We must ensure that the Democrats take over the House of Representatives and hopefully also the Senate. We must panic the country into a perception that everything that contract with America represents is gone, so that people who are elected to Congress on the Democratic line will behave above their level of personal morality as moral figures in the Congress. The way you get troops to function is you move them. Get them out of the barracks and move them. The way you get politicians to function morally is to panic them into doing so. You create a rush which they have no alternative but to do it. All the guys behind them will trample them. That's how you do it. And that's our objective. It is also our objective to change the foreign policy. And we are addressing not a particular issue. These days, people like to talk about issues, including abortions and other kinds of issues. We're not attacking an issue. We're attacking an axiom. Let me explain it to you. People say that we have opinions, but people don't have opinions. Opinions have them. They are gripped by opinions. They say, it's my opinion. No, you are owned by that opinion, not the opinion by you. And how do we form opinions? Well, I ask you to think of a simple Euclidean geometry, which some of you were exposed to somewhere in the educational process, which consists of a group of theorems and postulates, construction postulates. The characteristic of this collection of theorems, which we call a theorem lattice, is that all of the theorems are supposed to be deductively consistent, or deductively not inconsistent. And if we apply the methods of Socrates and Plato, we discover that the common features of the consistency of these theorems, interpretation of it, your assessment of it, is controlled. It's controlled by hidden beliefs, or beliefs which are in large degree hidden, assumptions, which have the character of axioms, postulates, and definitions. And every response you make is influenced, controlled, as a puppet by puppet strings, by the axioms, postulates, and definitions which you've accepted. Now, the progress of mankind shows that man has the ability to free himself from any fixed set of such assumptions, axioms, postulates, and definitions. That man is not condemned to behave in a traditional way. Man is not like a jackass, some are but not supposed to be, who has to behave the way his father behaved before him, and his grandfather before him, and his great-grandfather before him. That is the way a jackass behaves. That is not the way a human being behaves. For if human beings behave that way, then human beings would be what Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, professes to be. A pretentious fellow who considers himself a higher ape, who insists that people are the higher apes, trying to make monkeys of us all. Right? But we are not higher apes. For if we were any existing or imaginable type of higher ape, then under the conditions which existed on this planet during the recent 2 million years of the ice age in the northern hemisphere, this planet would never have seen more than several million living human individuals. Because we would have all behaved as our monkey-like, or baboon-like, or Prince Philip-like, the same thing, ancestors had behaved, our fathers, our grandfathers, great-grandfathers before us. The reason we are human is because we don't behave that way. Because we can make revolutions in our thinking. We can discover those assumptions of belief which grip us, those axioms, those postulates, those definitions. We can say, they're wrong. I am going to pull this thing out from me, free myself of this puppet string, and I'm going to think in a new way. That is what we call scientific and technological progress. And it's through scientific and technological progress that man has progressed so that at the end of the Middle Ages, we had reached on this planet several 100 million people. Resides in the fact that they share a set of common underlying assumptions, such as the assumptions of 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time in the Euclidean conception of space-time. The conception of the particle, of greater and lesser, all these things which are assumptions. They're not necessarily true, they're assumptions. And every theorem which is consistent will share a certain lack of inconsistency with these underlying assumptions. Now, people generally are not aware fully of the assumptions which control their opinion forming. And therefore, that of which you're not aware, but which controls you, grips you. And you behave in ways that you yourself can't understand because there are things going on in your mind of which you're not aware, which are forcing you to behave in a certain way. Axioms, postulates, definitions, which can be smoked out, but which in large part you may be totally unaware. Therefore, what happens is when you face an event, you react to the event with a proposition. Anything that occurs, looking at a sign on a street, or crossing a street, or meeting a person you've not met before, hearing something said you've not said, watching an accident, whatever. These things evoke from you a sense of how shall I respond to this? You attempt to articulate in one sense or another a response. That may be called a proposition. It may not be a proposition you're wedded to, but it's one you're offering tentatively. You say, I've got to think about it. I think it's this. I think this means I should do that. A proposition. You then examine the proposition, if you're a responsible person, and say, do I really believe that? What you're doing is you're doing the same thing you do in a geometry class when you're given a proposition. You are going to try to test the proposition to see if it passes the test of being a theorem. Are there inconsistencies which you can point out in what you're proposing which should force you to correct that proposition? And by this process of correcting your propositions, you end up with a theorem. You may not think much about it. It may just go on in your mind without much thought about it. But you end up with an opinion, which you might call a considered opinion, which decides whether or not you're going to act and how you're going to act. And so you go out and behave accordingly. But then step back and examine this. This means that you don't respond to events. You don't respond to reality. Your reaction to reality, your interpretation.
I know we're bringing in some more chairs if people are having difficulty. Well, good morning to all of you. I know for some of you who traveled today, your morning started quite some time ago. My name is Deborah Freeman. I'd like to welcome all of you to this EIR seminar. As you know, we find ourselves in a very tumultuous time, a time where I think if we follow events closely, as I know all of you do, there's very little that would argue against the fact that we're in the midst of a tremendous financial unraveling in a period of great political volatility. Of course, here in the United States, we're very close to our presidential elections. During the course of the last several months, Lyndon LaRouche, who is a candidate for the Democratic nomination for president, has, in a series of public addresses and national TV broadcasts, had a great deal to say about the current situation in the world and about the role that the United States should in fact play in it. Now, just a few weeks before the Democratic Convention, Mr. LaRouche has thrown the full weight of his presidential campaign into a drive to defeat, actually to impeach, the current governor of Pennsylvania, Tom Ridge, who Mr. LaRouche and others has charged is in fact guilty of pursuing a policy which is epitomized by the policies of the conservative revolution associated with Newt Gingrich, that would in fact be the equivalent, that are in fact the equivalent of crimes for which people were tried and hung at Nuremberg. We have recently purchased about 23 half-hour television spots that will broadcast in the state of Pennsylvania. We believe that this is the critical issue leading into the Democratic Convention, critical, in fact, to shaping the policy of our nation, both domestically and internationally. And I think that today you will learn much more about that, as well as other key issues. Just to tell you what the format is today, Mr. LaRouche will be our keynote speaker. We will have an opportunity for question and answers when he's done. There will then be a lunch break. We will reconvene after lunch for a major international presentation. There will also be Q&A after that, and I understand that Mr. LaRouche will also be available at that time. So now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you the founder of Executive Intelligence Review and Democratic